are, I believe this is it's the 11th week, 12th week. I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, it's the next to last lecture in this series on the Crusades, and I've lost count of the weeks. Tonight we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to sort of wind up all the information on the Crusades and sort of get to the end of the Crusades and talk about the end of the Crusades. We have the Fifth Crusade to talk about. We have the Crusades of St. Louis, which are interesting because they're called by a king and he's really in control and the Pope is not very involved. So in the evolution of the Crusades, this is something new after we spent so much time with Innocent III and how he dominated the Crusades. And then in the second half of the class tonight, we'll look at some of the very end movements of the Crusades, which I called Mongols, Mamluks, and missionaries, and we'll include in those the conquistadores. And so we'll sort of move into these movements that come at the end of the crusading movement, and then we'll talk about those and say, are they real crusades? Are they part of the Crusades? And what do they mean in the context of the whole Crusades? And of course, the Crusades, I mean, we're talking, we really started in the year 1000 when we talked about the precursors of the Crusade. We're really talking about a movement that may have lasted 600 or 700 years when you add it all together. If you say the causes of the Crusades go all the way back to the year 1000, and then they continue and they sort of reach a height under Innocent III, and then they develop even further and they get different, and everybody gets different. Europe gets different, the Muslim world gets different, and then the Europeans break out of Europe and start going in every direction. And I'm really going to argue, along with one of my dear friends, J.R.S. Phillips, in his book, The Medieval Expansion of Europe, and I'm going to argue that the exploration and discovery of the whole world is a result of the crusading movement, and that the crusading movement starts in the year 1000, and it sort of has its precursors with the Viking explorations. So that makes it a really long movement, doesn't it? I'm going even further than Jonathan Riley Smith, but I'm broadening the concept a little bit more. Okay, we'll get to J.R.S. Phillips in a little while, but first let's look at these very last crusades that we can call classical crusades, that are really on the model of normal crusades, and how they vary from the crusading model, the standard that we kind of saw maybe with the Third Crusade as a standard crusade. And then we'll look at how they differ and what sort of weird directions they start going in. Okay, we ended last time with the Albigensian Crusade, which was a quite bizarre crusade inside of Europe, I mean, against heretics. The fiefs, the Montforts held of the bishops and abbots merged into the royal domain, and the sort of end of the Albigensian Crusade was that southern France was absorbed into the royal domain of France. In the 1242 rebellion of Raymond, there was a massacre of inquisitors at Avignonet, south of Toulouse, by the heretics from Montségur, and at that point Raymond's vassals deserted him and Raymond submitted to the crown. Then the final event of the Albigensian Crusade was the siege of Montségur, which was an impenetrable fortress, and finally it surrendered, but 200 perfecti joyfully entered the flames rather than recant. And the fall of Montségur also weakened the structure of the Cathar Church because it deprived it of its headquarters, and it never recovered. The Inquisition triumphed in the end over the underground church, so the Inquisition now is established as an institution of this land. And here's a picture of these kind of rock-perched castles that are all over southern France, that Montségur is like these castles. This isn't Montségur itself. This is Rocamadour. And here it is again, but you can see what the Crusaders had to fight in this. And one of the things we saw was the formation of the orders of friars, the orders of little brothers. And the main one was the Dominicans, who marshaled the order of preachers. And at this time of the Albigensian Crusade, you see the formation under Innocent III of these orders of friars. The Dominicans and the Franciscans were the main ones. And they're orders of preachers. They're preaching on street corners against heresy. This, too, is a new institution in Europe, and we're going to see these Dominicans and these Franciscans start getting involved in later missionary efforts that resemble crusades. The order preachers had extraordinary powers to discover and investigate cases of heresy, and they're separate from the bishops. It's a whole new hierarchy outside the church hierarchy. The mere suspicion carried a presumption of guilt, and the accused could only clear themselves by confession and revealing more names. The penalties were giving alms and making 1 or 2 short pilgrimages, but hard cases were also often imprisoned for life and forfeiture of property. And there was, of course, the death penalty for relapsing, and people were burned at the stake. Raymond VII of Toulouse had no more children, and Jean, his daughter Jean, and Alphonse, the son of the French king, were childless, so Toulouse eventually reverted to the crown, and the northern French triumphed over the southern French. And here is a Dominican friar as one of the orders of preachers. Now, Innocent III preached the Fifth Crusade with the decree Quia Maior, and he taxed the church, and in England, France, and Germany, handbooks for preachers were published. And so as we see the crusade getting more and more institutionalized through the actions of Innocent III. Papal legates were sent to Scandinavia and France, where they preached, and they had these handbooks. And the Fourth Lateran Council on 11 November 1215, the papal bull Ad Liberandum was the most extensive and ambitious catalog of crusader rights and privileges. So what Innocent III did was formalized all of these institutions that had been building up, and he codified everything and he institutionalized everything. So now we can really say the church is institutionalized. The crusade is institutionalized. Okay, now we'll turn to the Fifth Crusade, St. Louis Crusades, and here I've made a mistake. This is not Frederick Barbarossa, this is Frederick II. Okay, I don't know why I did that. Slip of the memory there, okay. Now, all this time that the Crusades were being fought in the northern lands, in the Baltic, and also in the Albigensian area and in Spain, nevertheless, the goal of Jerusalem remained foremost in their minds, and they always wanted to reconquer Jerusalem and go back to Jerusalem. This is a German vision of Jerusalem that came from that book I was telling you I had that was so focused on the Northern Crusades of the German knights, the Teutonic Knights. The Fifth Crusade, as we said, was called by Innocent III on April in 1213, but Innocent died in July 1216. Nevertheless, people responded, and the crusade was organized anyway, even though Innocent had died. Duke Leopold VII of Austria was the first to depart, and King Andrew of Hungary, King Hugh I of Cyprus joined him at Acre. They all spent the winter of 1217 to 1218 in Palestine, where the small-scale fighting went on and nothing much was accomplished. King Andrew of Hungary then left in January and went home. Like Philip Augustus before him, he had just sort of put in a cameo appearance and said, I did my duty, and went home. In May 1218, the Fifth Crusade established a bridgehead on an island west of Damietta, and in August they captured a tower in the Nile and succeeded in dredging an abandoned canal to bring supplies and reinforcements. And in November they took Damietta. Okay, so this is the first step toward Cairo, which is the capital of the new empire. Okay, here's the departure of St. Louis for the crusade. I have this in the wrong place, actually. Okay, and here are the roots of the Fifth Crusaders. and all the contingents. There's a contingent, a northern fleet that came actually from Frisia, going along the coast here and this way. And some English and French went going overland here. The English are going this way in the purple lines, and the French are joining in, and the Hungarians went this way. So you can see where each of these groups went to the Holy Land, and here we pick them up again as they're coming into the Mediterranean, and they aim for Acre. When they get to Acre, then they go to Damietta, which is right down here, and this orange represents the little remnants of the Crusader states that are left. Just hardly anything is left. They call in at Cyprus. Of course, the king of Cyprus is on that crusade. Okay, and here's the taking of Damietta. I don't know which time. They actually took Damietta several times, but this one shows the taking of Damietta. The Egyptian Sultan al-Kamil offered to surrender the kingdom of Jerusalem if they would leave his homeland of Egypt. So he actually offered to give them Jerusalem, but the Christians once again were paralyzed by a leadership conflict between John of Brienne, king of Jerusalem, and the papal legate Pelagius of Albano. Pelagius refused the Sultan's offer to give him Jerusalem, and of course John of Brienne wanted it. And for 20 months, Pelagius waited for Frederick II to come and help them with the crusade, and Frederick, of course, never came. Yeah, Matthew.
Dare I ask this, how old is John at this time?
John of Brienne, if I can remember whether he's in his 70s, 80s, or 90s at this time, but I mean, he's a wonderful character. You know, this would be a wonderful master's thesis for somebody to do the life of John of Brienne. And you'd get to go to France and Italy and also the Holy Land to track down his documents, which would be neat. Anyway, he's a really interesting guy, and I would have to do his timeline to see exactly. This is before Frederick II. It's before he attacks Frederick II in Italy. So he must have been only maybe in his 70s at this point, because by the end of his career, he's about 90 when he's attacking Frederick in Italy. If any of you are interested in Frederick II, I brought this book by David Apolafia, which is the latest book on Frederick II, a medieval emperor. And it's a wonderful book. It's really vividly written if you're really interested in him. There's a lot more to him than just the little role in the Crusades that we've been looking at, but I thought I'd show you this book. Okay. But Pelagius was waiting for Frederick II, and he had big plans, of course, to conquer Egypt and then, drive the Muslims out of the Holy Land. So he turned down Jerusalem, and only an advanced force under Duke Louis of Bavaria arrived and marched south, and the march south began in 1221. Ignoring King John's advice, the Crusaders halted opposite Mansoura, which was heavily fortified. They should have passed it by. And here is the money of John of Brienne, and here we see his portrait. He's a really interesting guy. And of course, he's got a Crusader's cross on the reverse side of his coin. The supply lines from Damietta were blocked, and the dikes were broken to flood the surrounding countryside. And of course, the Muslims had done this to trap the Crusaders, and they were doomed. And so they agreed to leave Egypt, and so they snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory after they lost Damietta. Well, the major source for this crusade, that's the end of the Fifth Crusade. The next crusade is the Crusade of St. Louis, and the major source for that is Joinville, which is a history in these chronicles of the Crusades. Joinville writes a life of St. Louis, and this is a really wonderful source for St. Louis. It's a life of St. Louis that depicts St. Louis as a servant of God and the servant of his people, and talks about the two crusades that St. Louis went on. Okay, so Joinville portrayed St. Louis as the servant of God. He was a saint, and this is very important in the history of French kingship. This is the seal of the Lord of Joinville, who actually wrote this book. He is a courtier. He is a baron at the court of St. Louis. And to give you a little perspective on who St. Louis is, I gave you some handouts a little while back last week of the Capetian kings of France. And here they are. This is a very, very interesting genealogy of all the kings of France. I don't have all their wives on here. What do you notice about this genealogy that's interesting? Or what do you notice at all about it?
Seems like it was going from father to son to father to son to father to son.
Good.
Until the very end, it seemed like there wasn't any of this going to the cousins or the nephews of your sister's cousin or anything like that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. As compared to the genealogies we've had of the English kings and the genealogies we've had of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, where it kept switching to other branches of the family, this is one secret of the success of the French kings, that the kingship passed so regularly from father to son to father to son. And one historian has argued that this was a result of conscious policy of the French kings, that each king crowned his own son in his own lifetime and made him a co-ruler for when the father got older and felt it was almost time for him to die. He made the son a co-ruler within his own reign. And the kings cultivated an aura of sanctity. For example, touching for the king's evil is sort of like laying on hands and healing people in a sort of a miraculous way, so that they cultivated this aura of sanctity and holiness around their persons. They also had tremendous good luck, because they didn't have any dynastic struggles, and none of the brothers rebelled and tried to snatch the throne away. And this may have been because the oldest son was always crowned during the father's lifetime, but they managed their kingship very well, and which may have been a reason for their success. I see I have a mistake. No, I don't have a mistake on there. That's not a mistake. Okay. Good. So we see this very regular development of the line of kings, and we might mention Louis le Gros the Fat, Louis VI, who was very fortunate in having Abbot Suger as his publicity chairman, who wrote a life of St. Louis, which portrays, it's almost a saint's life, portraying him as the royal king and the king who could do no wrong. And so the sanctity of the kings grows after that. Philip Augustus, you recognize, who was, Augustus means conqueror, that he unified the kingdom. Louis VII was the victor of the Albigensian Crusade at the end, and Louis VIII was a saint who was actually sainted by Philip the Fair. And Philip the Fair, you remember, was so powerful that he tumbled the Templars from their seat of power. So here is this very strong dynasty that is developed. And St. Louis is Louis IX. He is the son of the Louis VII who actually won the Albigensian Crusade. In the end, he was the final victor. Blanche of Castile was his wife, and she was the mother of St. Louis, and Louis VIII died when he on the way home from the crusade, and Blanche was left with a young son, and she had to control all these unruly barons who rebelled against her. She did a wonderful job, and she is one of the great queens of France. Okay, so Joinville portrays St. Louis as the servant of God. He loved God and his people. He set a good example to his people, and the example was of moderation, humility, uprightness, truthfulness, and temperance. And so what he was a model of the perfect Christians for all his subjects to emulate. He was also wise in theological matters. He was very well educated, and he was educated in theology and philosophy, not just reading and writing and the sort of ordinary subjects. And he chose his servants for their uprightness and goodness, not necessarily for their intelligence or their talent or their loyalty, but because they were good people. He was wise in practical matters as well, and that's very important because he was an effective king, and a good king is a king who not only rules in a godly fashion, but rules in a practical fashion that rules well and maintains order. He knows and quotes the great philosophers, including St. Anselm, and he is a model of everything that God loves, a model for every one of his subjects to emulate. And here he is at his coronation, and he is crowned king by the grace of God, and so this then shows him being crowned with the bishops, and interestingly, this doesn't say coronation, but it says sacre, consecration of St. Louis. He's consecrated like a bishop with the holy oil, and that makes him a kind of priest king. It sanctifies him as a king. And so this is really emphasized in all the propaganda about St. Louis that's represented. And here he's shown adoring the saintly relics, and he's got a halo around his head. He's a king with a crowned, and here are all the priests and the monks watching him with the holy relics, and he's praying to. And notice there's a crusader emblem on the relics. He was strong in faith and belief, and he was also the servant of his people. He was a good king because he made the kingdom safe for the people. He administered justice well and promptly, and he governed his kingdom according to God's law. He hears the pleas daily at the city gate, rendering justice, hearing suits to court daily under an oak tree. And sometimes he administers justice in the public gardens of Paris. So administering justice is a major duty of the king, and here he's appearing as a model king. He hears Mass daily, and he guards and defends the cause of Christianity, again, one of the duties of a king. And not only does he care for the bodies of his citizens by keeping safety and peace in the realm, but also for the souls of his citizens. So he sort of guards their soul. He held the right to adjudicate over the clergy of his realm. And this is very important because in England, they almost had a civil war over whether the king could judge the clergy or not. Remember Becket? This was the issue that Becket was killed for, because Becket didn't want any of the criminous clerks tried in the king's court. They were to be tried in church courts, and here the French learned from that. And St. Louis, being a saint and a perfect king, was able to adjudicate or judge the clergy in his courts. So he went beyond the English in controlling his church. And here is Marguerite of Provence, who was his wife, and she was a lovely, charming girl. You don't hear much about her, but he did have children. Even though he was very saintly, he was married, and a saintly king should be married because it was his duty to have a child, a son especially, who would inherit the kingship, and a son that he would train up to be king in the proper way. So Marguerite was important. Now this is his money, okay, and it's interesting because the money is propaganda. Coins are so important because they're either gold or silver, and they're very treasured by people, so they look at them. So that they're a very good vehicle for propaganda. Now, what is the propagandistic image of these coins of St. Louis? What are the symbols here that you see? Yeah, Matthew or Travis, whichever.
Crusader symbols. It's on the left one, there's the cross and the banner, and on the right side, it's just a Crusader cross, the whole thing.
A Crusader cross, but it has the fleur de lis on it, which is the symbol, and it's on those Crusader crosses, which is a symbol of the King of France as well, sort of making the crusade a particularly French one. What do you think? What is this animal, do you think? Nobody know. What do you think is the animal?
It's supposed to be the Lamb of God.
It's the Lamb of God, yeah, clearly the Lamb of God, and it's got a halo around it. So Christ is the Lamb of God, but we've got a crusader. I think the image here is the Lamb of God as, I mean, the king is like equating him to Christ somehow, the servant of God, and also a Lamb of God. Agni Dio means the Lamb of God. Let's see, I can't read it upside down. Well, I should have read it before, but the Lamb of God, okay, here, Louis rules, it says, okay, around here. Yeah, but it's very religious, and the other coins have extolled the kings as heroes. Most of the other coins we've seen have been either the king seated on a throne or the king riding a horse like a conquering hero. And this is the servant of God. So this is an important image here. These are some important things that St. Louis built. Here's the crypt of La Sainte-Chapelle. It has two floors. This is the bottom floor, which is the crypt. This is an absolutely gorgeous little jewel box of a church. It is the ideal of a Gothic church. It's on the Ile-de-France, that island in the middle of the Seine where Paris originated and used to be the center of the French kingdom. And here it is. It's just this little teeny thing across the street from Notre Dame Cathedral. And this just gorgeous jewel box. You can't see the mosaics, and everything is painted gold and red and brilliant blues, and it's just beautiful. And here's the upstairs of the chapel, which is a real jewel box because it achieves this ideal of a skeleton church of these columns and holding up the pierced walls filled with the glorious stained glass. And again, unlike most cathedrals that we see, which the paint has all worn away on them, this is still kept up to date and painted to this day, and the colors are bright red and blue and gold, and the ceiling is dark blue with golden stars on it as a starry sky, and it's just a magnificent chapel that St. Louis built. Here it is on the outside. It's a little chapel. It's called La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and it's right next to the police department. You have to go through the police department to get in it, but you can see these skeleton walls and these stained glass windows, and it's extraordinarily small, but it's just gorgeous. And here is St. Louis carrying the relics, of course. This is, you would expect him to build that kind of a church. Here is the Seine and the site of his capital, this beautiful capital on the Seine where his church is, and there is Notre Dame as seen on the Seine. This is the back of the church, and La Sainte-Chapelle is right over here in that view. And here is Notre Dame, which is dated from the time of Louis the Fat, again carrying on this tradition of the French kings and the sanctity of the French kings. So Notre Dame was the first Gothic cathedral in all of Europe, and it was built on the design that Abbot Suger, who was the publicist of Louis the Fat, that he had built the church of Saint Denis, and then Notre Dame is modeled after that, with his ideals of piercing the walls and letting in the holy magical light of the stained glass windows. And so the Gothic ideal. And here is some of the sculpture on Sainte-Chapelle. Again, the high Gothic ideal of art that is represented on this little jewel box of a chapel. The reign of St. Louis is a kind of golden age, too, of France. Here are some pages from the Psalter of St. Louis, and the book production that's done is just miraculous. It's beautiful, beautiful artwork in the height of the Gothic art in France. So this is a page from the Psalter of St. Louis. And here is one in color from the Psalter of St. Louis, so that you can see a little bit of the beautiful illumination. I actually scanned this in. In the picture, it was real gold. I mean, it was real shiny gold because they actually painted it with gold paint, which was ground up gold. It didn't come out in the scanner. I'm sorry, but it's really a gorgeous picture in the height of Gothic art. Well, Louis also, as king, had the right to defend his subjects from false accusations of the clergy, so he could intervene between ordinary people and the clergy, and he held the right to act against the advice of his council of barons. Okay, this is a really unusual right that St. Louis had that superseded the rights of the barons. Now, this is the opposite of what happened in England. Remember that the barons with Magna Carta rebelled against the king and took control and made the king under the law. The king had to obey the law. What this means is St. Louis was not really under the law of the kingdom, but he could veto the advice of his barons and he could do anything he wanted. Gives him enormous power, but this is in the context of his love for fair and open dealing. He was so fair and so just and so good that everybody trusted him with these extraordinary powers. Okay? And what was the impact of his mother on his life? Blanche of Castile became queen and regent when he was just a young boy. And she had lots of trouble with the barons because they were so rebellious, which may be why he took this right to rule over the barons. But Blanche taught him to believe in God and to love God, and she brought up her son in the company of religious-minded people. And in a way, she was kind of a model mother as well. She made him recite the hours and listen to sermons, and she protected him against the revolts of the barons. His major enemies among the barons were the Count of Brittany, the Count of Boulogne, who was the king's uncle. Okay, this was a very dangerous time. Here is Blanche of Castile right here on the left, and she's shown almost as a joint ruler of St. Louis, and it kind of recalls to me the pictures I showed you earlier of Christ and Mary ruling together in partnership. You get a sort of you get an image of those sorts of pictures. And here is St. Louis again rendering justice as a really just and fair and sanctified king. This is Pierre of Brittany, who was one of his major enemies, and this is the Count of Boulogne, who was again his uncle, who was another one of his enemies. The Duke of Burgundy was one of his enemies, and the Queen of Cyprus, interestingly. His major allies were Count Thibaut of Champagne, who was later King of Navarre, and the Duke of Lorraine, and the Count of Poitiers, the Count of d'Artois, the king's brother. And let's look at a description of the king's court on page 187. Let's see. Okay. King Louis held a plenary court at Saumur in Anjou. I was there and can assure you that it was the most well-ordered court I have ever seen. At the high table next to the king sat the Count of Poitiers, whom His Majesty had knighted on St. John's Day. Next to him was the Count of Dreux, another newly made knight. Then came the Count de la Marche, and next to him the good Count Pierre de Brittany. In front of the king's table, facing the Comte de Dreux, sat my lord the King of Navarre in tunic and mantle of satin, well set off by a fine leather belt, a brooch, and a cap of gold tissue. I was set to carve his meat. The king's brother, the Comte d'Artois, stood facing His Majesty ready to serve his meat, while beside the count the good Comte Jean de Soissons wielded a carving knife. Imbert de Beaujeu, later High Constable of France, with Enguerrand de Coucy and Archambaud de Bourbon were on guard at the king's table, and behind them stood some 30 of their knights in tunics of silk to keep guard over their lords. Behind these knights stood a great company of sergeants in suits of taffeta, embroidered with the arms of the Comte de Poitiers. The king himself was wearing a tunic of blue satin and a bright red surcoat and mantle of the same material lined with ermine. On his head he wore a cotton cap, which was hardly becoming headgear for one who was still quite young. Okay, so here's his modesty, his humility. He's got an ermine cloak, but he wears a cotton cap. The king held this banquet in the hall of Saumur, which was said to have been built by the great King Henry of England, so that he might hold his own banquets there. This hall is constructed on the model of a cloister in a Cistercian monastery, but I do not believe there is any other hall that even approaches it in size. Okay, so there's a huge gathering of his loyal counts and their retainers and his own retainers there in this ceremonial in the king's court. St. Louis had 2 crusades, and both of them were disasters. On the first, his army was surrounded and he was made prisoner. And here is the Count of Poitiers, who was one of the king's allies. And here is the Count of Artois, his brother, who was also one of his allies. And notice he's got the fleur-de-lis all over his... let's see, what did the Count of Poitiers have? He had the fleur-de-lis too, so this either shows he's related to the king or he's a loyal servant of the king. And of course this one, the Count of Artois, has the fleur-de-lis all over his. There are various speculations and observations about the death are described in this book. The Saracens say, "You will not die before your time." In other words, you are predestined. Wherever you will die, that is, you die when you are predestined to die. The Christians, and again I'm quoting Joinville, his comments about what the Christians say, God brings you close to death so that you will appreciate life and God. Danger is a warning from God to test us and to make us reform. Death is punishment if we do not reform. God sends us these warnings of death out of his great love for us. Well, this is a kind of interesting comment. I kind of stuck this in here because it was such an interesting comment on the meaning of death in human life and the Muslim view compared to the Christian view. And of course, the crusade brings death very near. The whole business of is there death. And St. Louis actually went on crusade because he had been ill, he had been sick, and so he takes the cross in hopes of being cured and being well, so that when he became well, and here are the bishops actually advising him to take the cross and go on crusade so that he would recover from his illness. He organized the crusade in a typically royal and efficient manner. There was an impressive mobilization, but political rivalries minimized international support. He had an army of 15,000 men, including 2,500 knights recruited from the French crown lands of Flanders, Champagne, Burgundy, Brittany, and Poitou. They were bolstered by small contingents from Lorraine, Italy, Scotland, and 200 English knights. Louis sailed from I don't know how to pronounce this, from Aigues-Mortes. Anybody, a French scholar here who knows how to pronounce that? No, okay. I'm just guessing. Aigues-Mortes. On 25 August 1248, and he landed at Limassol in Cyprus on 17 September. The army gradually mustered there on Cyprus and departed for Egypt the following May. On 6 June, the Crusaders took Damietta with minimal losses, their only real success on the whole crusade. And so here is the departure of St. Louis for the crusade, and so he's on his ships leaving the town, and here is Aigues-Mortes, which is the town that he left from in southern France, which I still can't pronounce correctly, and here is where all the Crusaders came from. There was a contingent of Scots who marched down to London, and then they went with the English down here. The French are in blue and green, leaving from Paris and going down to Aigues-Mortes, and then they're all on the way to the Holy Land here. Meanwhile, we've got some Scandinavians who are going on this crusade from Norway around here, and some Frisians from Flanders who are also going on this crusade, sailing down the coast and around Spain. And here is the continuation of them as they go through the Mediterranean. The Norwegians coming both these ways, the Scots and English here, The Flemish also here on the way to the Holy Land, stopping at Cyprus and then going on to Antioch. Okay. And here is St. Louis dressed in his crusading garb, and this is as he appears in a stained glass window in the Cathedral of Chartres, St. Louis in the cathedral. In October, further reinforcements arrived from France and began to march towards Cairo on 20 November. They went down the Damietta branch of the Nile, and the Sultan al-Salih Ayyub died during the advance, and Egyptian morale collapsed. The Crusaders halted on the north bank opposite Mansoura, facing the bulk of the Egyptian forces, but they were unable to cross. But a local man turned traitor and revealed the unguarded ford downstream, and so the Crusaders crossed the ford on 8 February 1250, but Count Robert of Artois, Louis's brother, disobeyed instructions to wait and rashly led the vanguard to destruction in the narrow streets of Mansoura. And this was the turning point of the crusade. And here I did a little close-up here so that you can see Damietta on one of the branches of the Nile, and what they're heading for is Cairo. They want to capture Cairo, moving down the branch of the Nile. And of course they've come. This is a different map, but I just wanted to show Egypt and the Nile. Egyptian morale recovered with the arrival of a new sultan, Turan Shah, and Louis's army had lost too many men. They were exposed, outnumbered, and they retreated halfway back to Damietta. On 6 April, near Sharamsa, Louis surrendered and was surrounded and forced to surrender. On the 6th of May, after paying a huge ransom, Louis sailed to Acre, and Louis remained in the east for 4 years, taking over the government and negotiating truces. And what he did was take over, essentially, the Holy Land and just rule it. He fortified the cities of Acre, Jaffa, Caesarea, and Sidon. And in 24 April 1254, he finally departed. And so, was it a success or was it a failure? He did conquer Damietta, but he failed to get a foothold in Egypt and really take Egypt. And he did manage to fortify castles in the Holy Land and help them hold on for a while. He went back home and he ruled his kingdom again. He ruled very well. Then he went on his second crusade, and this ended when disease ravaged his knights and caused his own death in Tunisia. Okay, here we can see where he fortified these cities along the coast, and this was a good strategic move, because fortifying these cities along the coast of the Holy Land, these of course would be bases for attacking Damietta when he came back again the next time. Here he is in prison. He had been thrown in prison, they're actually showing him being stabbed, which is kind of frightening here. And then there he is being imprisoned by, and here's another version of showing him departing for the Holy Land here and being imprisoned here. So St. Louis in prison really shook people up back home to think of their king. This is Sidon, the castle at Sidon, which he fortified, and here you can see this castle here, which he actually built, and here are the ruins of it, the castle that St. Louis built. So in 4 years, of course, he could build a lot of castles. He took the cross again on 24 March 1267, and again, support beyond the Kingdom of France was limited. 300 knights under Prince Edward of England came, a Frisian fleet, and some Scots. Even his subjects' response was lukewarm for his second crusade. Only around 10,000 men took part, and once more he sailed from the unpronounceable Aiguë Morte on 2 July 1270 for a rendezvous at Cagliari in Sardinia. He announced that Tunis was the target this time. News had reached him that Emir Mohammed I of Tunis wanted to be baptized, and so on 18 July the fleet landed at Tunis. But many of the crusaders were struck down by disease, and on 25 August Louis himself died. So this really signaled the end of the crusade. And this crusade, we can see the Frisians coming along on this crusade, and St. Louis here is in red, coming to Tunis where he dies. St. Edward, or Edward of England and the Scots come along this way, and then actually it's the King Edward and the Scots who proceed on to the Holy Land at this point and go to Acre. But it's a disaster at Tunis. They didn't do anything they had wanted to. And here is the death of St. Louis from that same manuscript I showed you a minute ago. Here he is dying on his deathbed, and of course, being a saint, here he is. You can see his spirit in heaven, and here is his casket, and all these miracles are happening around his body. So this proves he's a true saint, because miracles happen with his body, which would be relics. You know, relics are bodies of saints, and so this proves he was a true saint. Louis's brother Charles of Anjou was now in effective command of the crusade. He secured a treaty beneficial to himself from Mohammed, and the Crusaders then sailed for Sicily in November. But the army rapidly disintegrated. Philip III, Louis' heir, took his father's remains back to France, and only Prince Edward of England proceeded to Acre, and he landed in May 1271. His brother Edmund joined him with reinforcements, but the forces were too limited to achieve much. After surviving an assassination attempt, Edward sailed home in September 1272. Now, the next event is, or actually I think Frederick II's excursion into the Holy Land was another of the great 13th century crusades. I think it's in between St. Louis' first crusade and his second crusade, if I have the dates right here. And here is the seal of Frederick of Germany. Notice, what do you notice about his seal? Anything symbolic here? I mean, it's not the Lamb of God by any means. But remember, yeah, any comments? Yeah.
He seems to be holding a sack of money or something in one hand.
Okay. That's called the orb. He's got the orb in one hand and the scepter in the other hand. The orb of the world in one hand, the scepter, and both of them have crosses on them. Okay. And here it's Frederick Rex. Oh, this is a very fancy one. It's hard to read. I don't think that says it Imperator. It says Rex. Doesn't say either one. It's hard to read. But of the Romans, okay. Of the Romans, Imperator. Okay. He's the emperor of the Romans. But here is Frederick going on his crusade. This is a more sophisticated. A more sophisticated coin. He's also king of Sicily. He's emperor of the Romans and king of Sicily. I wonder if he's king of the Germans as well. It's hard to read those letters. Okay. In 1239 to 1241, on the occasion of the end of the truce between Frederick II and Saladin, his crusade was called by Gregory IX. And Frederick, prior to going into the Holy Land, he actually arranged a diplomatic truce with Saladin, and this was looked at as somehow a breach of crusading courtesy or crusading practice by the Pope. That somehow this was not the way you did it. You don't win Jerusalem by a truce. You win it by warfare. So Pope Gregory IX called another crusade, and it was led by Peter of Dreux, the Count of Brittany, Theobald, Count of Champagne, and King of Navarre, some of the same people that were on the crusade with St. Louis, Henry, Count of Bar, Baldwin II, Emperor of Constantinople, and this would have been the Latin Empire of Constantinople, Henry of Beaujeu, Thomas of Marley, Hugh, Duke of Burgundy, and Amaury de Montfort, Simon's son. The only achievement of Frederick's crusade was it gave the Latin Empire a breathing space. Theobald, in fact, gained Jerusalem and southern Palestine by treaty, but again, this was not long-lasting, as nothing was. And I do have here the picture of Blanche of Navarre, who was the Queen of Navarre and the wife of the Count of Champagne. Okay, and here is the money of Frederick, again showing his the same sort of portrait of Frederick holding the orb and scepter and being crowned as a ruler, and then showing the great church that he built. And this is a common image of a king. The third wave of this crusade came from England with Richard, Earl of Cornwall, King Henry III's brother, William, Earl of Salisbury, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. And on 8 February 1241, the truce with Egypt was formally ratified. In 1244, much of this territory gained by treaty was lost, and Jerusalem was captured by the Khwarezmians. In 1241, Pope Gregory XI proclaimed a crusade against the Mongols, and in 1243, Pope Innocent IV confirmed it. So these are all, again, following what's happening that we see from the time of Innocent, that multi-crusades are being called at the same time. Anytime there's an enemy of Christianity, a crusade is called. So the Mongols are yet another group that the popes are calling crusade against. There's also crusading in Spain going on simultaneously to St. Louis and Frederick's crusades. There are constant petty wars against the Almohads. The two great leaders of the crusade in Spain were James I of Aragon and Ferdinand III of Castile. The reconquest became largely a national enterprise in Spain, because you didn't have the Pope really interfering and controlling the crusade in Spain. It was really controlled by the kings of Spain in a sort of separate way. Also, in Germany, there were small local crusades against heretics. The Stedinger peasants in Germany, the Bosnians, and the Bulgarians. And so you had lots of crusades going on at the same time in the same tradition that we saw set by Innocent III, and multi-crusades waged against anybody who was an enemy of the church following in that tradition. There were political crusades in Italy, especially, financed by an income tax on the churches of Northern Europe. In 1240, there was a crusade in Italy against the Emperor Frederick II of southern Italy and Germany. And in 1243, the Council of Lyon deposed the emperor. In 1244, the deposition was renewed by Pope Innocent IV. William of Holland, the anti-king, who was a rival to the throne of Germany, who actually was trying to supplant Frederick as king, and with the support of the Pope, he then took Aachen as his capital. And Aachen, of course, was the old capital of Charlemagne, so it had tremendous symbolic meaning for the Emperor of Germany. But in 1250, Frederick died, and the crusade was renewed in Italy against Conrad IV, his son. In 1255, there was a crusade in Italy against Manfred, who was Frederick's natural son. That means his bastard son. Nevertheless, who people turned to because Conrad IV was a very young child. And so Manfred took the leadership and tried to control what was going on in southern Italy. But what the Pope did was to grant Charles of Anjou the right to conquer Sicily. So Pope Urban IV granted Charles the right to conquer Sicily, and Charles set out in October 1265, and he actually does succeed in conquering Sicily. And what we see is the rise of Charles of Anjou in the Mediterranean political world, and meteoric rise which created a great Mediterranean empire. He took Sicily and part of the Latin Empire, and so then instigated the War of the Sicilian Vespers. And so we have Italy then and just sort of convulsed with civil war at the end of all of these crusades in southern Italy. And I mean, it upset the whole political situation in Italy. When Frederick II died, his empire, and he was such a great, strong king, but his empire absolutely collapsed. And he had held it together, and it utterly fell apart, largely at the instigation of the papacy. And from that time forward, Germany's path was all downhill. Okay, we have a little bit of time for questions, comments, discussion. Yeah, Travis.
I almost hate to open this can of worms, but do we really want to call Frederick's crusade a crusade? Because wasn't he an excommunicate and denounced by the Pope for his actions?
Yes, yes, he was. Can we call it a crusade? That's a wonderful question. What do you all think?
Because while he was gone, the Pope was calling other crusades against his lands.
Yes. Can we call it a crusade? What do you think, Stephen? You press your mic.
If I were to say, then no. But
you don't think it was a crusade?
no, because even though popular leadership could easily result in a crusade, because you could call people to you just as Peter the Hermit did in the very beginning. He wasn't a pope, and he was calling people to his cause even before Council of Clermont. But this is a bit to a more extreme degree, because it's not only separate from the church, it's against the church, supposedly, or an ideology against the church. So I wouldn't classify it as such.
Well, how do you determine when a crusade is a crusade?
Not by any standard that I know of.
I mean, is it only the Pope who can call something a crusade, or is it, but remember, they have no word for crusade. They have no word for crusade. So how are you going to determine whether it's a crusade or not? I mean, obviously, historians are labeling Frederick's ventures into the Holy Land crusades. So why are they doing that? Simply because he's going into the Holy Land? Or, I mean, is the Pope right that you have to actually fight battles? You can't do it by treaty and diplomacy, or it's not a crusade? What do you think, Matthew?
If going on a crusade means going to the Holy Land, then why do they call the Albigensian Crusade now a crusade? I mean,
okay,
that's
good.
yeah, that's the counter argument to is it just going to the Holy Land?
So going to the Holy Land doesn't determine what a crusade is. What does?
And if you call what happened in Spain a crusade, then it doesn't necessarily have to be called by a pope.
Good. Okay, because remember, mostly what was happening in Spain was pretty localized. It was just happening on a local level, and the popes weren't very involved in the Spanish Crusades. Yeah, Stephen was first.
Yeah, but even in that case, the popes might not have called it, but they said, you guys have enough problems of your own, so you don't have to get involved with this other crusading stuff. I mean, eventually it probably could have been called a crusade because it was at least sanctioned by the popes.
So you're using as one of your criteria that a crusade has to be sanctioned by the Pope.
Not that it's sanctioned by the Pope, but that it would be sanctioned by, what would be a proper word, the common leadership, or it could be associated with the general ideology of the leadership of the church. Not that the Pope actually came out and said this is a crusade or this is in line with what I'm thinking, but that it's not actually actively opposed to the church establishment.
Okay, and so you view Frederick as being opposed to the church establishment. That's
not opposed to the establishment itself, but he was at odds with it.
Yeah. Well, actually, though, I mean, the Pope sort of misunderstood. He excommunicated him because he didn't go on crusade, and then he sort of, when Frederick did go on crusade, it's a circular argument.
He wrote a letter of apology back to the Pope, or something like that, right?
Oh, yeah, Travis.
Well, my understanding is the only reason that he did go on crusade was because he stole the kingdom of Jerusalem he usurped the kingship after promising not to, and so then he had a vested interest.
Yeah, but this is our good friend John of Brienne in his 80s or 70s at this point, who, he did. He kind of usurped the throne for his son, but his son would have had it anyway. But John of Brienne, remember, thought that John of Brienne instructed his legate to negotiate with Frederick so that John would remain king his whole life. Maybe Frederick had a premonition that John of Brienne would never die, would be king forever, or he would live forever. But at any rate, he did kind of usurp the throne, and so. But the Pope was always down on him. Frederick is a very, very interesting character. He was doing a lot of interesting things that have been thought of as not very Christian.
I could see why the Pope would be down on him after he sabotaged the Fifth Crusade.
Yeah. Well, he didn't sabotage. He just didn't come when he was supposed to. He didn't make his way out there. But there's a larger struggle going on because the Pope wants to think of the Emperor of Germany as his servant. And so he is trying to push a political theory, a political relationship on the emperor, who is resisting with all his might because he doesn't want to be a vassal of the Pope or the Pope's servant. Yeah, Matthew.
Which calls the question: is a crusade a religious venture, or can it be a political venture? Or is it? Obviously, there's politics involved, but can a crusade be a purely political venture? Or does there have to be some sort of religious purpose mixed in?
Well, what do you all think about that? I mean, is the crusade in Italy against Manfred later and also against Frederick, fought by John of Brienne, is that a real crusade? And I mean, by your definition, Travis, would it be a crusade?
Well, my definition of crusade is it has to involve indulgences. So mine goes back to it has to be supported by the church for it to be a crusade. So I mean, because the crusades evolved over the 300 years now, almost.
Yeah.
So, yes, those would have been crusades, and Frederick's would not have been.
Because there's no religious motive.
Well, and because it was not sanctioned by the church, because they wrote to the Holy Land and said, don't listen to Frederick, don't do what he says, he's not one of us.
Right. Okay. But what about the crusade in Italy against Frederick? Is that a real crusade? What do you think? Anybody have an idea on that? Stephen does. Okay.
Well, it seems like the biggest reason why it wouldn't be considered a crusade is that crusading up until this point, or up until that point, had been the idea of saving Christians from some kind of outside force. And no matter where you're looking at it, whether it's in Spain or going against the heretics or actually going to the Holy Land, that's a bit different than the political ones that you're mentioning here, and I wouldn't classify it as a crusade.
Well, the Crusades first start out to save Christians, but then the motivation changes as time goes by. Especially in the Northern Crusades, the motivation is to convert non-Christians to Christianity, and then you get some sense of that in some other crusades, that one of the goals is to convert people.
Well, wasn't part of that just the idea of the expansion of the church? It's in Christian interest to do that kind of thing.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that anybody had a conscious idea of expansion of the church. They didn't have an image of a map in their minds because they didn't know how to draw maps. So they didn't have an image of Christianity expanding. They did have an image of converting people. I think their vision was a little bit more limited. It's kind of different from our vision. Does somebody else have something to say on that point? But it's. I don't think the Pope had in mind at any point expansion of Christianity. Certainly in the Holy Land, the thought was to win back the places, the sacred places, and that was the original motivation. Not to convert people, but to save Christians, as you said, and to win back the holy places. Now, that was not the motivation that they had in the Baltic Crusades in the north of Europe. That was a little bit, what they did was do some spinning of the story, that they invented the tale that the area of Prussia was the dowry of St. Mary and that they had to win it back for her. I don't know where that story got started or what the rationale of that story was, but that they twisted it around so that they were defending Christianity by defending and recapturing the dowry of Mary. Totally fictitious. And then you had this just huge concentration on Mary in those Baltic lands and those northern lands. But then they had to convert everybody, and the idea was to convert everybody, but also to get the land and to rule it. So you have mixed motives going on. None of these crusades have pure motives. I mean, in the Spanish crusade, they're trying to win back Spain, the Spanish lands. They're trying to get back those lands that used to belong to Christianity. They're driving the Muslims out, and they're filling the lands with colonies, with colonists who go in there as settlers into the land. And that's what's happening in the Baltic lands of Germany, too. They're bringing in German colonists to the lands that are today Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Finland, bringing in German colonists side by side. And they would have conquered Poland, too, if the Poles hadn't been strong enough to keep them out. So, each one of these crusades has a kind of different slant to it. And so how are you going to determine what a crusade is and what characterizes a crusade? There must be some common denominator that you can reduce it to. Travis said it has to benefit the Pope.
I think it has to benefit the church.
Benefit the church?
Yeah, the further, it's not just, it may be conversion, which it evolved into in later crusades, but originally it was the defense of the church.
Yes.
And there were indulgences. Mm-hmm. So the common denominator is the church. Does the Pope have to call it? I would say no, because Christians, you may follow the Pope as a spiritual leader, and I don't want to get into the church mm-hmm. arguments, but nevertheless Christians can act upon their faith in God and crusade.
And St. Louis' crusades are wonderful proof of that, where he is absolutely sidestepping the Pope. I didn't mention the Pope in any of St. Louis' crusades. Louis decided he was going to go on crusade. He called the crusade. He led the crusade. He was the one who got everybody to come. He financed it, and the Pope had nothing to do with it. Yeah, Travis.
But he had the Pope's approval.
Oh, he did. He did. But it, it's so important to think of St. Louis and his sanctified nature as king, that he is going to be a saint. And people in his own lifetime sort of thought of him as a future saint. His grandson, Philip the Fair, had him sanctified. Of course, Philip the Fair is also the one who captured the Pope and dragged him off to Avignon and displaced the papacy out of Rome and centered it in Avignon for 100 years in France. So Philip had some control of the church, but St. Louis kind of represents a turning point in the power of kingship, which is now beginning to eclipse the power of the papacy. And so Louis calls those crusades. Yeah.
I think Gary's onto something with the Crusades benefiting the church, whether or not they were called by the papacy, whether or not they were more for spiritual religious motives like they were in the Holy Land, or whether they were more for political motives like they were in the Crusades, like in Sicily or in Aquitania. The end result is that the church and ultimately the papacy did benefit from it. It expanded the overall power. Not maybe not in terms of land area, but not necessarily in land area, but in terms of religious influence in one way, shape, or form.
I think Pope Innocent III would certainly agree with you there. Pope Innocent would certainly see those crusades as benefiting the papacy. If you benefit the papacy, you benefit the church, in his view. Yeah, Travis.
Well, I think even Urban II would agree, because he had motives of restoring the power of his branch of papacy, of the Reformed papacy, instead of the imperial papacy. When he called crusades, that was one of his objectives.
I think it was. Actually, there's nowhere that he makes a statement, but I was proposing that theory to you. I don't know that anyone has done it, but I could be accused of reading history backward in asserting that Urban had those motives, but certainly the result of the crusade was that the papacy was enormously legitimized where it hadn't been legitimized before. Yeah, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say, couldn't you also say it benefits the kingship in the sense of wanting to relive what the olden kings, the olden days kind of thing did, and it would secure their power in a sense more by coming home saying, I went on a crusade and this guy didn't. And,
yes.
you know, so I see it also in a sense of it secured their power at home by actually going out and doing something and coming back. And it gave them more rights to do something at home than, say, someone who didn't.
That was certainly true of Philip Augustus on the Third Crusade, who just sort of zipped over there and said, I'm here, I'm on crusade, and then zipped back home to take care of his government. And he just did it for, you know, the publicity. Yeah, Travis, did you have a comment?
I think that as time progressed and the Pope's power got weaker and kings got stronger, I think that there was less of that type of a motivation, because leaving Europe was for the king to leave Europe was very dangerous for him, because he always had enemies and rivals. It'd be like leaving the hen house unguarded.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Gary?
Well, I think too, like in the Fourth Crusade, you could add on just causes as being part of a crusade, evolving from indulgences and defense of the Christianity to the Christians fighting for just causes, such as in Zara helping Venice, but even later in Constantinople, they were excommunicants until Innocent rethought it and then absolved them of that.
Yeah, okay. So that could be, yeah.
Also, again, going on with that idea of expanding the power of the church, when we had the conquistadors go into the New World and conquer the land and convert all the natives in that area. Again, I mean, it may not necessarily be expansion of church land, even though some of that did occur. It was more political / religious influence that got expanded. And at that time, they thought they were going into they're going to Japan and China. They weren't going exploring into a new continent.
No, they thought they were, well...
I mean, reality versus perception. I mean, they perceive themselves as going to Japan and to the Pacific Islands instead of actually reaching the New World.
Yeah, they perceived themselves going there, but and they all the conquistadors went with various motives of getting rich and trading and getting spices but once they discovered the New World and the natives, then a lot of priests and monks went to convert them, and so one could argue that's a crusade. Yeah, did you have a comment?
Couldn't you also say that it was just a mesh of everything? There wasn't really one motive, because there were so many motives depending on the situations that were happening. I mean, yeah, there was religious, there was political, there was whatever, but it kind of served its purpose for its time that it was given, is how I see it. And whatever, if a pope preached, you need to go, then they went. But if it was the king's thing, like, hey, I'm going to go to get more power, then they went. It just depended on what happened at that time, in the sense, and I see it more as a mesh of everything.
I think that's true. At any given time, we have a mix of motives for any given one. Stephen, did you have another comment along that line, or?
No, it was going back a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, I think one thing that really comes clear when you kind of look at all these different crusades and all the different motives is that you kind of start with one motive, and then there's an evolution, and things are changing, and new motives come in as time goes on, as people see the usefulness of using crusade for different purposes. The the first purpose, the first crusade, I really think Urban saw a chance to advance the church, but he gave people he suggested the motives of saving their souls with the indulgences, of recapturing these lands lost to the infidels, and regaining them for Christianity, and so it just grew, it just snowballed from there. Yeah.
Therefore, you could call the Northern Crusades, Albigensian Crusade, the Sicilian Crusade, as legitimate crusades. However, the Crusade of Frederick II would not necessarily be a legitimate crusade.
Okay.
tying it all back together.
Yeah, well, but then could we say the Crusade of Philip Augustus was legitimate, because he didn't do much? I mean, all he did was put in an appearance and turn around and go right back home. I mean.
However, it was the quote-unquote intention of Philip Augustus to help expand the power of the church. Yes, his own personal political power as well, but on a higher level, it was to help the church. Whereas Frederick II was more concerned securing his own rights to the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Yeah, okay, securing his own rights to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That certainly makes sense. Well, I think we're going to take some even more bizarre crusades, like the crusades against the Mongols and the Mamluks, and then all the missionaries that go out to China and Persia and the New World. And that's what we'll do when we come back from our break, which we need to take right now for about 15 minutes.